Hello everybody, I'm excited to introduce you to a new series, the Kart Racer Game Dev series. So what we're going to do in this series is we're going to create a 3D kart racing game, very much like Mario Kart or Diddy Kong Racer. What we're going to do in this series, we're going to learn some game development, including game physics, audio, effects, controls, animation, and we're going to use the Unity game engine for that. And we're also going to do some of the graphics ourselves. So we're going to be doing some modeling, some pretty basic animations, and some texturing. We're going to be using Blender for that purpose. So the purpose of this video is to get you started in all of the software. So we're going to download and get all the software up and running, and you should be able to follow along with me and then have your tools ready by the time we get started on the next step. One of the things, just first before we start, I want to point out that we're not going to be learning programming basics, so this isn't going to be a way for you to learn programming for the first time. If you already know programming in C#, that would be great. If you know programming in Python, that should work too. Usually pretty easy to pick up a new programming language if you already have one pretty solid. If you're pretty shaky on your programming, I'll include some links down in the description for you to learn a little bit and practice your programming specifically with C#. Okay, so the versions of the tools that we're going to be using in this series is going to be Blender 2.82. You can see that's in alpha right now. I expect before too long it'll be in beta and release version. It's not really that different. Any Blender 2.8 version should be pretty similar. We're also going to be using Unity 2019.3. 2020 is out, but it's not yet in release at this time of this recording, and so I figured I'd just use 2019. Some of the changes that were introduced in Unity 2020, we're not really going to be using them anyway. Okay, so first of all, Blender. So Blender is a 3D package. It's basically a whole suite. It can do a lot. It has its own game engine if you want it. It can do modeling, it can do simulations, it can do all kinds of stuff. We're going to be using it for basically a modeler. Of course, you can do rendering and stuff, but that's not really going to be super helpful for us. We just want to create some basic models and export them to Unity. So that's what we're going to be using it for. It's an open source product, so if you're a supporter of open source like I am, then you can feel good about using some open source product. It is possible for you to donate, as you can see on the website here, if you want to support this project. Now Unity, on the other hand, is a game engine. It is not an open source project. It is free. There actually is a game engine called Godot, which is open source. The only reason I'm not using that is I'm really not that familiar with it. I've been using Unity for a couple of years and I have some experience with it. I am still learning, but I have some experience with it. Godot I've only been using for a couple of months and really not that much, so I don't know enough to create a video game development series. But anyway, it is a really great option. You could theoretically create all of your game components using open source software. So maybe that would be the topic of a future series. For right now, anyway, we're going to use Unity. It is possible to use Unity for free. You can download and use it for free for personal use. If you want to release your game for commercial purposes, there's just a limit to the amount of revenue that you can make. And in fact, the limit is pretty high. I think it's something like $100,000 per year. So you just have to pay for a license once you pass that $100,000 mark. So I'd say that's a pretty free license. For the code, we're also going to be using Visual Studio Community, which is also not open source. It is free to use. If you do want an open source product, there is MonoDevelop, which you could use instead. And in fact, if you're using Linux, that's kind of the only option available because you can't use Visual Studio. But if you're using Windows or Mac OS, you have a choice between using Visual Studio and MonoDevelop. I'm going to be using Visual Studio because I use Visual Studio on a regular basis anyway. But both really are serving the purpose just fine. I don't think you'll see any big differences from your point of view if you're going to use MonoDevelop. You'll still be able to follow along with the tutorials. So what we're going to do today is, I'm assuming that most of the people watching this are going to be using Windows. Anybody that's using Mac OS and Linux, the process is quite similar, but I'm going to use Windows as my demonstration here. So first let's get started with Blender. We'll go kind of chronologically here because we're going to be doing some Blender work first, and then we'll import it into Unity. So first what I'm going to do is download Blender. Okay, so Windows installer. Looks good. Okay, so it's not a particularly big program, so we'll let that download. I guess while that's going, we'll also get Unity downloading. So let's go to Unity here, and I'll just scroll up to the top and go to Get Started. So that's another option there. And we're just going to pick the individual category here. You can see you do have to pay these subscription plans. If you're a student and you can prove that you're a student, with an educational email address, then I would recommend that you use this option here, except if you're planning on using this to create a game that you want to release commercially. If you want to release a game for free, this would be fine. If you want to do some work just for fun, just to learn how to develop games, this would be perfectly fine. It comes with a couple of extra features which are pretty nice. The dark theme I really like, but I'll just be using the personal version, so anybody that's not a student can have the same features that I have. Okay, so what we want to do is we're going to, I know that you might be a first-time user, but I'm going to go to the returning users section because I know exactly what to download. And I'm just going to accept the terms of service. You should read them, obviously, but I've already read them. I'm going to click on this Download Unity Hub. Now, Unity Hub is not actually Unity. Unity Hub is a really small program, and what it is basically is an entry point into Unity where you can select your projects, and then you can have multiple versions of Unity. So you can have different projects with different versions of Unity, which actually I find really, really helpful. If I need a newer version of Unity, I can use it, but I don't have to overwrite my version of Unity, which might break some of my older games. I can have multiple versions running concurrently. So let's actually save that as well. All right, let's check on Blender. So it looks like Blender is done being downloaded. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click on that, and I'm going to install it. And it's a pretty easy install. Just follow the instructions here. Just accept the license agreement. And I'm just going to install it in the default location here in the Program Files folder. And we'll just let that install. It's not a particularly big program. Unity actually is kind of big. Let's just give it a second to install. Okay, and we're done. And I'm going to open it up just to make sure that it works in just a minute, but let's get Unity going as well so that we can be as efficient as possible. So we've got the Unity Hub setup file also installed. Let's click on that. And this is also a really small file, so it should install very quickly. When we actually want to install the Unity version, that's what's going to be pretty big. So I might have to clip some of that out. Okay, I'm installing it in the default folder, Program Files folder. Alright, so it gives me an option to run Unity Hub. Let's not bother to do that because I want to run Blender first. Okay, so let's look up Blender now that it's been installed. Okay, so there it is. Just want to make sure that it works the very first time. Okay, so when it first starts up, it gives you some information so that you can customize the interface. If you want to click on your 3D objects or the parts of the 3D object with the left mouse button, make sure you select left. That's what I'm going to be using. You don't have to do what I'm doing, but that's what I'm going to be using. The rest of the stuff isn't super important. Personally, I'm a dark theme person if I have the option. I won't have the option in Unity, but we'll have the option in Blender. Anyways, nice, easy on the eyes, and it looks cool, so that's good for me. Just going to click next, and basically then this just gives us an option to create a new file. We don't really need any of that, so I'm just going to click away, and you'll see that we actually have a 3D scene here with just our lame little cube, but we're going to turn this cube into something cool in our next video. Okay, so this is actually what we're going to be doing next. So I'll describe what we're doing right at the end. Okay, so it looks like Blender is working. It's possible for Blender to export in all kinds of different formats, including a few that are recognized by Unity. So now let's run Unity and make sure Unity is up and running. This is going to take a little bit more effort. So what we're going to do in this case is I'm of course going to grant permission, but you see that it has no Unity version. So up here you have a list of all the projects. We shouldn't have any projects. Actually, I do have one because I had Unity installed before. There's also some resources if you want to learn some things. There's some pretty cool stuff. Hey, look, they have a karting game too. I swear to you, that was not the motivation for this series, but that's pretty neat anyway. I think I'll check that out later. Anyway, so we'll go into installs. Since we don't have any installs, we can actually use Unity. So we have to go up here to add. And as I said, we're going to be using 2019.3. So these versions right here, especially after the 3, they're going to change pretty quickly. Okay, so you can see that there's Unity 2020. It's a couple different versions here that are in pre-release. These could potentially be buggy. Right now, anyway, I don't really want to deal with that during this tutorial. So I'm going to pick the latest release version. These ones are long-term releases, so if you're actually a game development studio, you probably want to stick to something like 2018.4, unless you absolutely have to have the features that were introduced in 2019. One of the things I like about 2019 is they revamped the user interface. It looks a lot nicer and cleaner. It's a little easier on the eyes. But anyway, that's what we're going to be using. So this number here is probably going to be different for you, but as long as it says 2019.3, you should be good. So I'm just going to click Next. And then whenever you install Unity, it gives you an option of whether or not you want to install Visual Studio. This, by the way, will only happen on Windows. For Mac OS and Linux, you'll have to install a different editor. I mentioned that there's MonoDevelop. You can get Visual Studio for Mac, but it doesn't get installed by the Unity Hub automatically. Another thing you need to do every time you install Unity is you need to pick what platforms you're going to build for. Now we're actually able to run the game directly inside Unity, so there's no need to install any of these. You can see that they're actually pretty big. But if we ever want to build a release version for our game, then we'll have to make sure that we install every single one of these that we want to deploy to. So it's possible that our karting game will eventually get ported to the mobile platforms, and so we might select something like Android and iOS, or we want to keep it a desktop game, so we'll do Linux, Mac, or Universal Windows platform. We may want to deploy it to the web using WebGL, that kind of thing. So there's a whole bunch of different possibilities for us. We could do a whole bunch of things, I think. Maybe we'll just start with the basic kart racer. We'll keep it a desktop game. And maybe we'll add a little supplementary series for making it an Android game or just a mobile game. And maybe another supplementary series for making it like virtual reality or augmented reality or something like that. But for starters, let's just actually get the game going. So I'm not going to pick any of these platforms, but I am going to make sure that Microsoft Visual Studio Community is installed. So Community Edition of Visual Studio is the free version that I was telling you about. Okay, so we'll just go ahead and install this. I'm going to accept the terms and conditions. Again, I've already read them. Go ahead and check them out. But I've read them before. And I'm going to let this install. This is going to take a little while. Okay, so I'm going to let this happen in the background. Okay, so anyway, what I'm going to do then, while we're waiting for that to install, because I actually do want to test this out, it's going to have to install not only Unity, which is about ½ a gigabyte, it's also going to install Visual Studio, which is more than 1 gigabyte, so it's quite a bit to install and download. It does this all like directly from the internet, so it could take a little while. So I'm just going to leave that for right now, and if we wanted to install the platforms as well, it would take even longer. So that's going to take a little while. I'll snip it out if it's taking too long. But in the meantime, let's head over to Blender. What we're going to do in the next video is we're going to create our kart. I think that's a good starting point. We'll probably end up flipping back and forth between Unity and Blender. But I'm going to start with Blender so that we can create a basic kart. And eventually we'll have to make a track, and we'll have to make characters to go in the karts, and probably more than one kart. I don't know if I'll do all of those on camera, but we'll do a few so that you can start to learn the ropes of the various software packages. But sometimes I'll be taking you through the basics so that you can just start from nothing and build. And so one of the things that you're going to need if you're going to use Blender, at least if you're going to use it effectively, is you're going to need two things actually. Ideally, a keyboard with a numpad would be necessary because there are a lot of keyboard shortcuts in Blender, and the numbers on the keypad actually have different functionality than the numbers at the top of your keyboard. So for example, right now I'm using the 4 and the 6 key to rotate around this cube that I'm currently looking at. Okay, now actually 4 and 6 key up at the top of the keyboard don't do that. They do something else. And you can also go up and down. This is all using the numpad. And so that's really helpful. The other thing that you're going to need is a 3-button mouse, preferably with a scroll wheel in the middle. Using a trackpad is not really going to cut it, unfortunately. It is possible, and there are some alternatives that you can do. I'll try to put some links down in the description just to give you an idea of what you could do if you absolutely don't have that. But it really does help if you have a mouse with a scroll wheel, and the scroll wheel usually has a clickable button integrated and 2 other buttons. And we're going to be using that because the easiest way to work in Blender is to actually use the mouse and the keyboard simultaneously. So we're very rarely going to go up into the menu. I will show you some menu alternatives if you don't have the keyboard numpad with a numpad, and if you don't have the mouse. I'll show you how to use these controls over here and these controls right here, which basically are equivalent to them, but generally speaking, it will be a lot better for you if you have those devices, because you can use it more quickly. You won't have to go like back and forth between these controls and your model. You can keep your mouse in the general vicinity of the model that you're working on, and let the keys and the mouse controls do the work for you, so you don't have to go back and forth. Just for efficiency, it makes you a better modeler and makes you work a little faster. But anyway, that's how that goes. Okay. Right now I'm not going to have any plugins for Blender. Before our next video, however, I am going to turn on the screen keys so that down here you'll be able to see the keys that I'm using. I'm also going to try my best to remember to tell you what keys I'm using every single time I do something. I'm going to say, well, let's do this, push this B key, select this, and so you'll be able to follow along with every single step. Anyway, so that's what I'll do, but if I happen to forget, they should be up on the screen here, so you should be able to pause the video. It will be really important for you to have a second monitor. Would be very helpful, because you can have the video so you can watch what I'm doing, and you can also do what you're doing at the same time. You'll be able to pause the video and do the steps that I just described, and then resume the video. So that would be ideal, but if you're not able to do that, you can actually set it up so that you could use multiple workspaces and switch between the workspaces. I actually frequently do that, so I might have something like Unity open in this workspace, and then the next workspace to the right I might have Visual Studio. I'm not sure actually if my screen recording software is going to actually keep recording as I go to a different workspace. I'll have to test that out, but anyway, if it doesn't, then I'll just switch the other way, which is not so bad. Okay. Anyway, so we'll go back to Unity here. So it's just installing Visual Studio. Alright, so I'm going to pause the video and I'll come back when this is done installing. Okay, we're back. So Visual Studio is installed. Everything should be good to go. So I'm going to click on Projects here, and I'm going to create a new project. So if you click this little arrow next to New, it'll let you select which version of Unity you have. Now we only happen to have one, but most people are going to have more than one version of Unity. So I'll show you this one. So this is the 2019.3.13 version that we just installed. Yours might be a little different, but anyway. Okay, so I'm putting all of my projects in this folder, which is on my second drive. You should put yours on wherever folder you think is appropriate. Make sure it's someplace where you're not going to lose it. Make sure that you choose a 3D project. You have a couple of different options actually. You could choose a universal render pipeline. You could use a high definition pipeline. Because of my lack of graphic skills, this is mostly going to be like a low poly game. So I'm going with a relatively basic. So we're just going to pick 3D. Okay, so I'm going to call this Car Racer. We'll click Create. And we're not going to do any development today, but I just want to make sure that all the tools are working. So let's let Unity start up. So we're going to test Unity. I think it's going to be fine. And I'm just going to show you quickly how to set up Unity to use Visual Studio, which was installed in the background. It does take a little while to open up a game that you haven't opened before, or including a new game, which gives you kind of a starting template project. Unity projects can be quite large, and it takes all of the assets. It will import them into your computer. When you open them up the second time, it's actually much quicker. Okay, so here's the Unity environment. Obviously, in a future video, when we import our card into Unity and we want to play around with some of it, maybe make some of the controls or whatever we're going to do in that first video, I will give you a tour and show you how to use it, just like I will in the next video for Blender. But in the meantime, to check to make sure everything is working, let's first of all go over here, which are all the objects in our scene. We have a camera, and we also have a light. Let's add one more thing. What I'm going to do is right-click here. You can also click this plus, but I'm going to right-click, go to 3D Object, Cube, match our Blender scene. So that we've got a cube in our Blender scene, and we've got a cube in our Unity game. And I'm not going to do anything too magical with this cube, but let's just add a script to this cube, so that'll make it spin around. Okay, before I do that though, I'm going to go to Edit, Preferences. Okay, so in the Edit menu, Preferences, then we're going to pick External Tools. You probably is not selected by default, so select External Tools. And down in this drop down here where it says External Script Editor, because I had this installed previously or remembered, you can pick one of the C# capable editors that you have on your system. I specifically want Visual Studio 2019. The default version is open by extension, which if you just install Visual Studio on your machine, that might be actually what you have. But make sure that you select Visual Studio 2019, because by selecting this, it's going to create special supplementary files for Visual Studio. So Visual Studio can help your experience be a little bit better, including things like autocomplete and stuff like that, documentation and such. Okay, so I just picked Visual Studio 2019. I'm going to close that, and I'm going to create a new script on our cube. So I'm going to select the cube over here, and down here I'm going to go to Add Component, and I'm going to create a component that's just called Auto Rotator. Nothing too special. It's just going to be a script that's going to make our cube spin around. Okay, so you can see if it's not a built-in component, I just type in something like Auto Rotator, which doesn't exist in Unity, that assumes I want to create a script with that name. So I'm going to pick New Script, and I'm going to click Create and Add. So that's going to create a new script, as you can see here, and it's also eventually going to add it to our cube. So if we look down here at the bottom, we have an Auto Rotator script right here. So in order to open this in Visual Studio, I can double click this right here, or I can double click this right here. It doesn't really matter which one. They are the same script. And of course I can add the script to other components. Okay. Alright, so Visual Studio, we're going to have to create an account. For me, we don't have to worry about that right now. And of course you know what I'm going for here. The theme is always going to be dark if that's an option for me. Okay, so for the development settings, you can set up a whole bunch of different things if you want to. Specifically, you could do Visual C# if you wanted to. I'm going to leave mine at General because personally I do other development in Visual Studio that's not just C#, so it makes sense for me to keep it General. But if you want to specifically go for Visual C#, that's not going to really make much of a difference. Okay, so click Start Visual Studio. This Visual Studio's icon right here. So it's going to take a quick second for that to load up. That's obviously going to take much less time in the future. We have fewer setup processes to go through, but it's going to open up our script. So there we go. There's our script. Okay, we'll just zoom in a little bit so we can see a little more clearly. We'll obviously go through scripting in Unity and we'll learn what these functions do. But this one right here is actually called every single frame. So if our game is executing at 60 frames a second, this is going to execute every 1/60th of a second. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm literally just going to rotate the cube. So I'm going to say transform.rotate. As I said before, We'll go through the details of this later, so don't worry about anything about the syntax of C# or any of these built-in objects in Unity. We'll go through all of that. But you can see I get some autocomplete stuff down here, so if I don't remember what some function is called, for example, I just type in transform and then I hit dot, it's going to give me a whole bunch of suggestions, which is actually a really great way to learn. So we're going to rotate, and basically the way you rotate is you provide a vector which has 3 angles. So we can rotate around the x-axis. I'm going to rotate 0.0 around the x-axis. I want to rotate around the y-axis, which is the up and down axis. So I'm going to rotate by, I don't know, 0.1 on the y-axis and 0.0 on the z-axis. Okay, so now I'm just going to save that. I'm going to use Control S to save the script. And we'll go back to Unity. After a quick second, Unity will kind of flicker for a quick second, and what it's doing is it's compiling and integrating that script into the game. So now up here we can play our game by just clicking this little play button. It's going to open up the game view, and there we can see our cube, and it's rotating around. So it looks like the code is working. We have autocomplete working in Visual Studio. Double-clicking on a script opens up Visual Studio, and we can create and play a really simple game in Unity. Obviously this is useless, but anyway, making sure that all the software is working is a really important step before getting started. Okay, so the very next step then is going to be doing some of the modeling. So we're going to model our cart, or at least the first cart, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create some background images that we're going to use as a reference, and then what we're going to do is I'm going to use a technique called box modeling to create a relatively basic low poly cart. Eventually we might create a more rounded, more high geometry version of the cart later on. But honestly, with my art skills, we might just go with low poly. A lot of times in these tutorials, people will say, we're going to go with low poly because I love that art style. That's probably partly true, but it's also probably the case that they're just really not that great at art. And they want to kind of de-emphasize the art and focus on some other stuff. I'm just going to come out and say it. I'm not that great of an artist, so that's the reason why. Okay, so we are also, by the way, we're going to have a GitHub repository where you'll be able to download everything I've done right after each video. So I'm going to create a commit for every single stage in the development of this game. So if it turns out you messed something up, you weren't able to follow along exactly, shouldn't be a problem. You should be able to download my copy and start from there, or maybe compare. Maybe something's going on with your code and you want to see how your code is different than my code. You can download my code and compare them side by side. Again, Unity projects are pretty big, so this GitHub will be quite large. Basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it all into the same GitHub, including all the graphics and stuff. I won't bother to create the GitHub until we start working in Unity, so that'll probably be the third video. So the next video is just developing the model. So the third video, when we integrate the model into Unity, I'll post that on the GitHub repository along with the game that we've created. Anyway, and so it'll be pretty big. I'll try to trim out as much stuff from the repository as I can without breaking the application, so that you can just download and use it. But anyway, that's just something you should know. You won't need that unless you actually want to download my copy. I really strongly recommend that you follow along and create your own copy, because you're not learning nearly as much if you just download my code. If you just want to download my code to play a kart racer when I'm finally finished, by all means, if that's what you want to do, no problem. It's a free game. But if you actually want to follow along, learn something about Unity and Blender, then I would suggest you do it along with me, because the learning experience is much greater that way. Alright, so as I said, next week we're going to be doing some Blender modeling. I won't do a whole lot of texturing, just really basic texturing. There won't be any animations. I'm just going to create a static mesh, and then in the subsequent video we'll import that mesh into Unity and try to get some controls going. Alright, I'll see you next time.